Think about the last time you bought something you didn't need. Not food, not medicine, not anything urgent. Just something that caught your eye and somehow, quietly, made you feel like you had to have it. Maybe it was a jacket, a notebook, a pair of headphones. You told yourself it was practical. But deep down, you know that wasn't really why. There was something else, something harder to name. The object felt like it belonged to you, even before you owned it. Like it already knew something about who you are or who you wanted to be. And that feeling, it wasn't an accident. So before we talk about brands, before we talk about logos and marketing and billion-dollar companies, we need to ask something much more personal. Why do we give objects meaning in the first place? To understand why objects mean so much to us today, we have to go back, not to the first advertisement, not to the first logo. Further than that, we have to go back to a time when humans had almost nothing. Thousands of years ago, before writing, before cities, before money, people still marked things. They carved symbols into tools. They painted patterns onto pottery. They pressed their mark into soft clay before it hardened. These weren't decorations. They were statements. A symbol on a clay jar meant, "This was made by me." It meant, "I was here. This is mine." That impulse, the need to say this came from someone, this belongs to someone, is one of the oldest things about us. And it wasn't only about ownership. In ancient markets across the Mediterranean, craftsmen marked their goods to signal quality. A potter in Rome who had spent decades perfecting his work wanted buyers to know the difference between his bowls and a cheaper imitation. His mark was a promise. It said, "I stand behind this. You can trust it." Archaeologists have found Roman clay lamps and ceramic vessels with maker's stamps, still visible after 2,000 years. The names are gone, the workshops are dust, but the marks remain. This is important, my friends, because it tells us something. The mark was never just practical. It was always personal. Even then, a symbol carried weight that the object alone could not. 2 identical jars of olive oil. Same size, same shape, same contents. But one had a mark from a trusted maker. And people would pay more for it. Choose it first. Carry it home with a different kind of care. Why? Because the mark said something the object couldn't say for itself. It connected the thing in your hands to a person, a place, a history. It transformed a simple container into something with a story behind it. And humans, it turns out, are not very good at separating objects from their stories. There's something in the way our minds work. We don't experience things in isolation. We experience them in context, wrapped in memory, association, feeling. A child holds a worn, stuffed animal that has no material value whatsoever, and yet would cry for hours if it were lost. Not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. The same instinct that made an ancient Roman trust a stamped clay lamp lives inside that child, lives inside all of us. We don't just use things, we attach ourselves to them. And those early craftsmen, without knowing it, without any grand strategy, discovered something that would take thousands of years to fully understand, that a mark on an object is not just information, it is an invitation. An invitation for the human mind to feel something. That discovery, quiet and ancient, is where everything begins. For most of human history, the distance between a maker and a buyer was small. You walked to the market. You saw the potter, the baker, the weaver. You could look them in the eye, ask questions, touch the work. The mark on an object mattered. But you also had the person standing right there behind it. Then everything changed. In the mid-1800s, factories began producing goods at a scale no single craftsman ever could. One factory could make 10,000 bars of soap in the time it took an artisan to make 50. Machines wove fabric faster than human hands could follow. The world filled up with products, identical, efficient, and completely anonymous. And that anonymity was a problem. When a bar of soap sits on a shelf with 100 other identical bars, the buyer has no potter to look in the eye, no weaver to ask questions. The personal connection, the thing that had given objects meaning for thousands of years, was suddenly gone. What remained was just a product, uniform, interchangeable, easy to forget. Companies began to understand that they had to solve this, not with better products alone, but with something that could travel with the product, something that could replace the human connection that the factory had removed. They needed a mark. But not just any mark. They needed a mark that carried a feeling. This is the moment, my friends, when branding, as we understand it today, was truly born. In the 1870s, a soap company in the United States called Procter & Gamble began wrapping their products in consistent packaging with a single recognizable name, Ivory. They ran newspaper advertisements. They used the same image, the same words, the same tone, again and again across thousands of miles. For the first time in history, a product had the same face whether you bought it in New York or in a small town in Ohio. The mark had become a system, and something quietly remarkable happened. People began to trust the name before they ever used the product. A woman walking into a general store in 1885 might never have met anyone from Procter & Gamble. She didn't know the workers. She couldn't see the factory, but she recognized the name. She had seen it in her newspaper. Her neighbor had mentioned it, and that recognition, that simple repeated familiarity, created something that felt like trust. This is worth pausing on. Trust, for most of human history, came from relationship, from time spent together, from watching someone's hands do careful work. But now, trust could be manufactured. It could be built not through presence, but through repetition. A name, seen enough times, begins to feel like a friend. The factories had broken the old bond between maker and buyer, but branding quietly built a new one, made not of hands and faces, but of symbols, colors, and carefully chosen words. The object hadn't changed, but the feeling around it had. And that feeling, it turned out, was worth more than the object itself. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Everything we've talked about so far has a kind of warmth to it. Ancient craftsmen leaving their marks. Companies trying to rebuild human connection in an impersonal world. It sounds almost noble. And in some ways it was. But at some point, something shifted. Companies began to realize that they weren't just reflecting the feelings people had about objects. They were creating those feelings. Deliberately. Carefully. With precision that would have surprised even the most skilled craftsmen. And that changes everything. In the early 20th century, a man named Edward Bernays began advising corporations on something he called the engineering of consent. He understood, deeply, uncomfortably, that human beings don't make decisions based purely on need or logic. They make decisions based on feeling, on identity, on a quiet desire to belong. And if you could shape those feelings, you could shape behavior. He once helped a tobacco company convince women to smoke in public, not by talking about the cigarettes at all, but by connecting them to the idea of independence, of freedom. The cigarettes became symbols before they became habits. Women weren't buying a product. They believed they were making a statement about who they were. The object hadn't changed. The engineering had. This is the hidden cost, my friends. Not hidden in the sense that no one knows, but hidden in the sense that we rarely feel it in the moment. Because the feeling is real. When you hold something that carries a powerful brand, the weight of it, the familiarity of it, that emotion in your chest is not fake. It is genuinely yours. But it was placed there. Think about that for a moment. The warmth you feel toward certain objects, toward a particular logo, a specific color, a brand you've grown up with, much of that was constructed, tested in focus groups, refined in boardrooms, delivered to you through thousands of small, repeated impressions until it felt like your own natural feeling. A young man saves for months to buy a pair of shoes from a brand he admires. He feels pride when he wears them. Confidence, a sense that something about him has been confirmed. That feeling is completely real. It changes how he walks into a room, but the feeling was not born inside him. It was built around the object, piece by piece, long before he ever saw it. We are not weak for feeling this way. We are human. Our minds are meaning-making machines. We were built to attach stories to things, to find identity in objects, to feel belonging through symbols. These instincts are ancient and deep, but they were also, for the first time in history, being studied, mapped, and used. The craftsman in ancient Rome pressed his mark into clay and hoped it would build trust. That was honest. What came after was something else. Not always dishonest, but no longer innocent either. The meaning you feel when you hold a branded object is yours, but the path that led you to feel it, that was carefully designed by someone who understood your mind, perhaps better than you did yourself. And once you see that, you cannot quite unsee it. And yet, we didn't stop. Knowing that meaning is manufactured didn't make us immune to it. If anything, the system grew larger, faster, and more intimate than anyone in the early 20th century could have imagined. Because somewhere along the way, something changed in how people related to brands. It stopped being something done to us and started feeling like something you chose. That shift is what makes the modern world so fascinating and so difficult to read clearly. By the late 20th century, brands were no longer just attached to products. They were attached to lifestyles, to values, to entire visions of who a person could be. A company didn't just sell running shoes anymore. It sold the identity of someone who pushes limits, who refuses to quit, who stands apart from the crowd. Another company didn't just sell computers. It sold the idea of creative rebellion, of thinking differently in a world full of conformists. The product was almost secondary. In 1988, a marketing consultant named Stephen King, not the novelist, wrote something that still feels sharp today. He noted that a product can be copied by a competitor, but a brand is unique. A product can become outdated, but a successful brand, if cared for, is timeless. Companies absorbed this idea completely. They stopped competing on what things did and started competing on what things meant. And consumers didn't resist. They participated. People began choosing brands the way they once chose communities. A teenager in the 1990s who wore a specific brand of skateboarding shoes wasn't just making a fashion choice, he was announcing membership. Saying, "I belong to this world. These are my people." The object on his feet was a social language, readable by anyone who knew the dialect. This is what normalization looks like, my friends. Not force, not deception in any obvious sense, just a gradual deepening until the system becomes invisible because it is everywhere. Today, the average person in a developed country is exposed to somewhere between 310,000 brand impressions every single day, logos, colors, sounds, shapes that belong to companies. The range of that estimate is wide because researchers genuinely disagree. But even the lowest number is remarkable. 300 quiet reminders, daily, of what things mean and what meaning says about you. A woman stands in a supermarket choosing between two nearly identical products, same ingredients, similar price. She reaches for the one she recognizes, the one whose colors she has seen since childhood, whose name her mother used. She doesn't think about it. She doesn't need to. The decision was made long before she walked into the store. That is the system, fully formed. Not a conspiracy, not a trick, just the natural result of decades of meaning being layered, quietly and consistently, onto the objects around us. We live inside it the way fish live inside water. It is not invisible because it is hidden. It is invisible because it is home. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is this. Even knowing all of this, most of us still feel something real when we hold an object we love. The engineering is real, and the feeling is real. Both things are true at once. So, where does that leave us? We know the history now. The ancient marks pressed into clay, the factories that broke the bond between maker and buyer, the careful engineers of feeling who rebuilt that bond, not from honesty, but from strategy. The system that grew so large, it became the air we breathe. And still, the feeling remains. This is the part that deserves the most stillness, because the easy conclusion, the one that feels satisfying after everything we've discussed, would be to say, it's all manufactured, therefore it's all empty. The meaning isn't real. The attachment is an illusion. Put the object down and walk away free. But that conclusion is too simple, and I think if you sit with it honestly, you already know that, because meaning has never come from nowhere. Not in any part of human life. The stories we tell about our families, shaped by memory, by time, by the version of events we needed to believe. The songs that carry entire years of our lives inside 3 minutes of sound. The places that feel sacred not because of the ground itself, but because of what happened there, what we felt there, who we were there. None of this meaning was born purely from the thing itself. It was always built, always layered, always partly constructed by forces outside our control. Brands are not so different. They are one more way that meaning moves through the world. What makes us human is not that we perceive meaning objectively. We never have. What makes us human is that we cannot stop making meaning at all. We are the animal that turns a clay jar into a statement of identity, that turns a pair of shoes into a declaration of belonging, that turns a logo into something that feels, on certain mornings, like a small piece of home. The philosopher Donald Winnicott once wrote about what he called transitional objects, the worn blanket, the beloved toy that a child carries everywhere. He said these objects exist in a space between the self and the world, neither fully real nor fully imaginary, both at once. The object holds something the child cannot yet hold inside themselves. Comfort, safety, continuity. We never fully outgrow that need, my friends. We just find more sophisticated objects to carry it for us. The question, then, is not whether we should feel things about objects. We will. We always have. The question is whether we feel them consciously, whether we choose at least sometimes to look at the object in our hands and ask, what do I actually believe about this? What was placed here for me to feel? And what did I bring myself? That small moment of pause is not cynicism. It is not the death of feeling, it is something rarer. A kind of gentle honesty with yourself about the world you live in and the mind you carry through it. You can love the object and understand its history. You can feel the warmth and know it was partly engineered. These are not opposites. They're both true, and holding both of them at once is, perhaps, what it means to be a thoughtful person in a world full of carefully made things. The mark on the clay jar was never just clay. It was always, in some quiet way, a question. Who am I? What do I value? Where do I belong? We've been answering that question with objects for thousands of years, long before the factories, long before the focus groups, long before anyone thought to call it branding. And we will keep answering it. In the choices we make, the things we carry, the objects we reach for without thinking, for as long as we are here. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.